They were still reading the terms of Earth's surrender when I reached the floor of the chamber that had exiled me 40 years before. The steward of the rolls stood at the speaking rail with the instrument open in his four hands, his voice pitched in the flat ceremonial register the Korath use for documents they consider already settled. Reinstatement under tutelage, he read. Probationary seating in the outer gallery. A supervisory commission to audit Earth's compliance. Waiver of the accumulated isolation debt, granted in the Concord's generosity, in exchange for the immediate transfer of all human hulls of war to Concord Joint Command. He read it the way you read a verdict to a prisoner who has already been measured for the chains. I walked the long aisle while he read, and the chamber turned to watch me come. 200 tiers of the Hall of the Aligned, rising in pale circles toward the great glass dome, and perhaps half of them filled. That was the first thing I marked. 40 years ago, on the day of the vote, there had not been an empty seat in the House. Now whole delegations were missing, the rim species, the border worlds, the ones whose home skies were currently being divided up by the Celtascendency, while this body read documents aloud in a beautiful room. My name is Ruth Sequeira. I was 41 years old when the Concord of Aligned Stars voted by a show of hands to seal humanity behind the cordon. I am 81 now. I had been the last Ambassador Earth ever seated in this hall, and I had walked out of it down this same aisle without saying a word, because there was nothing to say to 200 raised hands. I had not expected to see the room again in my lifetime. Neither, I think, had the room expected to see me. The steward faltered when he recognized me. It took him a moment. Korath read human faces poorly, and the face that left this chamber had been 40 years younger. But the rolls hold portraits, and he was the keeper of the rolls. His upper hands closed the instrument very slowly. The petitioner from Earth, he announced, has arrived. The envoy, I said, has arrived. It was not a correction the chamber understood yet. That was all right. I had crossed 11 weeks of space to stand in this room, and I had learned, across 40 years of building something in the dark, that a chamber like this one only learns at the speed of its own embarrassment. First Speaker Audreyne Val presided from the high bench, and I will say this for her. She was not one of the 200. She had been a junior assembly clerk on the day of the vote, an Iliath girl with the pale luminous skin of her kind standing at the tally desk counting hands. I remembered her because she had counted them twice, as if hoping the number would change. Now she wore the speaker's iron collar, and her chamber was at war, and she looked down at me from the bench with a carefully arranged calm of an official who has spent 6 weeks praying that the thing she summoned would actually come. Ambassador Sequeira, she said. The Concord welcomes Earth's return. Earth has not returned, I said. I have. A stir moved along the lower tiers, the dry rustle of robes that passes for murmuring among species who do not murmur. I took my place not at the member's desk they had pointedly prepared for me, third tier, outer arc, the seating of a probationary client, but at the petitioner's rail in the center of the floor where the accused had once stood, where I had stood on the last day. My aide came down the aisle behind me and set the credential case on the rail. His name is Anders Holt. He is 34. He was born 19 years after the cordon closed, on a world this chamber has never heard of. He opened the case without ceremony. Credentials, he said, of the first envoy of the Meridian Compact. The steward of the rolls took the document the way an old priest takes an unfamiliar scripture. He read it once. He turned it over, examined the seal, a meridian line crossing an open circle. Nothing this hall had ever stamped or issued, and read it again. Then he did the thing I had crossed 11 weeks of space to watch him do. He turned to his registry, the great cyan index of every polity, protectorate, and licensed species in Concord space, and he searched it, and the registry returned nothing. Speaker, he said slowly, the issuing authority is not in the rolls. No, I agreed. It wouldn't be. Val's long hands settled flat on the bench. Around her, in the high seats, the standing committee of the Concord leaned toward one another, and the rustle in the tiers thickened into something with an edge in it. 40 years of silence beyond the cordon, and the silence had just handed them a seal they could not file. I want to be precise about what this chamber believed on that morning, because everything that followed grew out of it. The Concord believed that Earth was a contained problem and a salvageable asset. Their last census of human space was 36 years old. 9 settled systems, 14 billion people, an immature fleet, a species too quarrelsome to federate and too small to threaten anyone, which had not stopped this hall from voting that we were constitutionally incompatible with Concord peace, after the Brell Reach incident gave the fearful the excuse they had been waiting a generation for. They believed the cordon they drew around us had held us at that size, the way a jar holds a specimen. They believed their summons had reached a grateful colony. And they believed all of it because believing it had been free for 40 years, right up until the Celtascendency came down on their rim like a hand closing, and the cost of every comfortable assumption in this room came due in the same season. Ambassador, Vol said. She kept using the old title, and I let her because the argument was coming anyway and there was no profit in having it twice. The chamber has before it the instrument of reinstatement. The steward will complete the reading. The steward can spare his voice, I said. Earth is not applying. The words went out into the hall, and the hall did not know what to do with them. At the Sken delegation's arc, War Master Drosk came up out of his seat to his full height, gray plates shifting along his shoulders. The Sken sit lowest in the chamber and stand, tallest in it, and they had lost 2 fleets at Cassiv in the spring. At the Brel tables, the trade masters had gone very still in a way I noted and kept. And high on the third circle, in the small poor seats the hall gives to small poor species, the delegate of the Eveni rose quietly and pressed both narrow hands flat against her breastbone, which is the oldest gesture of honor her people have, and held it and did not care who saw. Her name was Mir. I will come back to Mir. 6 delegations voted against the exile of Earth 40 years ago out of 220 present, and the Eveni were the first of the 6. Not applying, Val repeated. The Meridian Compact does not seek membership in the Concord, I said. It has received the Concord summons. It has sent me to hear what the Concord wishes to say. That is the whole of my brief, Speaker, and I would hear it sooner rather than later. Your rim is on fire. It was the longest string of sentences I would give them for some days, and even so, a part of me sat apart and I measured it against the discipline I had carried for 40 years. Say less. The exile's first law, written by people who had learned in this very room what explanation purchases from a body that has already counted its hands. We do not plead our case to the Concord. We state or we are silent. Drosk's voice came down from the Sken arc like gravel poured from a height. What, he said, is the Meridian Compact? I looked up at him. He was being honest, at least. He was the only one in the chamber honest enough to ask it plainly. It is the polity that answered your letter, I said. The speaker's gavel tone sounded. The Iliath used a struck chime, a single cold note, and the session dissolved into the procedural churn that great bodies used to hide their disorder. Committees were invoked. The steward was directed to query the deep registry. The instrument of reinstatement, which 6 weeks of drafting had polished into its perfect condescension, was tabled pending clarification of the recipient's legal identity, which is the most honest sentence the Concord produced that day. Through all of it, I stood at the petitioner's rail and said nothing further, and let the room do what rooms like this one do, and watch the half-empty tears pretend they were not watching me. Anders leaned in once under the noise. They drafted 40 pages of terms, he said quietly, for 9 systems and 14 billion people. They drafted them for the Earth they remember, I said. Be patient with them. The remembering is about to get strenuous. High above the bench, through the great dome that crowns the Hall of the Aligned, the sky of Vale Tessera was a hard, bright blue and empty. The Concord's home fleet had gone to the rim in the spring. Most of it had not come back. I had read the Cassiv dispatches on the crossing. 11 weeks is a long time to read, and I knew, better than most of the delegates below that dome knew, exactly how empty their sky was and exactly what was scheduled in 19 days to fill it. They had sent their summons to a jar they believed still held its specimen. Something else had been growing in the dark all those years on the far side of their fence. And it had very good manners, and it had answered the letter, and it was standing in their chamber asking, politely, to hear them say aloud what it was they wanted. What they wanted was rescue. What they had offered was a leash. The distance between those two things was the entire moral architecture of the Concord of Aligned Stars. And I had come back at 81 to walk them down it one step at a time. The chime sounded again, session adjourned to the morrow. The tiers rose, 200 species worth of robes and plates and ceremonial silks moving for the doors, and not one in delegation crossed the floor to greet the envoy at the rail except one. Mir of the Eveni came down the long stair from the third circle, small and gray and unhurried, while her betters pretended not to see, and she stopped in front of me and looked up. The Eveni stand no higher than a human child. And she said, in careful Terran she had learned from freighter crews her government officially knew nothing about. You came back. We were asked, I said. 40 years, she said. We wondered if you would hate us too much to come. I looked past her, up the empty aisle, at the doors I had once walked out of without a word, while 200 raised hands hung in the air behind me like a forest with no birds in it. Hate was never the question, delegate, I said. The question was always whether this room could learn. We are about to find out together. She pressed her hands to her breastbone again and went out. Anders closed the credential case, and I stood a while longer in the well of the Hall of the Aligned, an old woman in a chamber built to make everyone feel small. And I did not feel small, and that, after everything, after the vote and the silence and the 40 years, that was the fact I would have liked to. mail backward through time to the woman who walked out of this room with her hands shaking in her coat pockets. We did not die behind your fence, I would have told her. Walk out slowly, keep your back straight. The fence becomes a wall, and the wall becomes a border, and the border, in the fullness of time, becomes the place where their messengers stand knocking. The second day opened with the Concorde's Intelligence Directorate explaining to the chamber, with charts, precisely how little it knew, though that was not the title of the briefing. The title of the briefing was The Human Question, a strategic assessment, and the officer who delivered it was an Iliath analyst with the pale, glow-mottled skin of Vol's people and a voice like a librarian reading a eulogy. He projected the old census above the floor in cyan light. Human space as of 36 years ago. 9 systems, 14 billion souls. Industrial index, modest. Fleet assessment, coastal, their word for a navy that cannot leave its own porch. The cordon, a clean white line drawn around the whole of it like a hand cupped over a candle. Following the closure, the analyst said, monitoring of the human volume was maintained by the cordon watch stations until the 41st year of the Vol the Elder administration, when the stations were, he chose the word with visible care, consolidated. Defunded, said someone in the Korath, tears dry as paper. Consolidated, the analyst said. Subsequent intelligence derives from indirect sources, spectral observation, traffic inference. The human volume has remained quiet. Our working model holds that the contained population has stabilized at or near the census figure, with limited intra-cordon expansion and no significant naval development. He said it in the chamber where I was standing. That is the detail I want understood. The working model was presented with charts to a hall containing the first envoy of a polity their registry could not find, whose credential seal their archivists had spent the previous evening failing to trace, and the model said, quiet, contained, stable, small. Not one officer of the directorate looked down at the rail where the contradiction stood in a dark blue coat, watching them. Anders, beside me, wrote one line on his slate and tilted it so only I could read it. They cupped the candle and never once looked under their hand. The speaker's chime cut the briefing short before questions, which told me Vol already understood the directorate was describing a country that no longer existed. She simply could not yet afford to say so in public. What she could afford was the next item, which the Standing Committee had clearly spent the night sharpening, the restatement of terms. It came from the committee's senior member, an Iliath grandee named Councillor Ethiv, who had been a young delegate on the day of the vote, and whose hand, the minutes would later confirm, had gone up with the 200. Ethiv spoke beautifully. The Iliath always do. Their voices carry harmonics that other species' ears read as sincerity, which is one of the reasons they have chaired the Concorde for 3 centuries. The Concorde's offer is made in friendship, Ethiv said, and in recognition of humanity's long, and we acknowledge, patient compliance with the closure. The galaxy is changed. The ascendancy presses the rim. The Concorde extends its hand to every species of goodwill, and to Earth it extends more than its hand. Full restoration of standing, in time. Forgiveness of all isolation debts. A path supervised but real back into the family of aligned stars. We ask in return only what any family asks of its members in a season of danger. The Concorde requires the service of Earth's ships. He let the harmonics hang in the dome, and we are confident, he finished, that a species which has spent 40 years in reflection will recognize generosity when it is shown. 200 tears looked at me. I let them look. 40 years ago, I would have answered the substance, clause by clause, the way they train you to in the diplomatic academies of a young, nervous species that still believes councils are persuaded by content. I am no longer young, my species is no longer nervous, and I have learned what this chamber actually trades in, which is posture. The compact has heard the offer, I said. I am required to ask one question of clarification. Ethiv spread his long hands graciously. When the Concorde says Earth's ships, I said, how many ships does the Concorde believe it is asking for? Silence has a texture in that hall. The dome gathers it. Ethiv's hand stayed open a moment too long, because the honest answer was a number from a 36-year-old census, the coastal navy, the candle under the hand, and some animal instinct in him, older than his politics, had begun to suspect the number was wrong, and he could not say it aloud without staking the Concorde's dignity on it. The chamber, he said finally, would welcome the ambassador's own accounting. I am sure it would, I said, and sat down. That was the whole of my morning. 4 sentences. I commend the method to anyone who must negotiate with a body that outnumbers them 200 to 1. Make the room ask the question it is afraid of, and then let the room sit with its own silence. The tears rustled for a long time. The directorate's analyst, I noticed, had quietly begun packing away his charts. The war reached into the chamber an hour past midday. It came as a dispatch rider, a skin courier in field gray who had clearly not been given time to wash, walking fast up the floor to the skin arc with a sealed spool held in both hands like something hot. Drosk read it standing. Then he did a thing I had been told the skin do only at funerals. He removed the War Master's chain from around his neck, held it a moment, and set it down on the desk in front of him with a small exact click that carried to every tier of a suddenly soundless hall. "Thaloran has fallen," he said. "The Ascendancy took the orbitals in 9 hours. The garrison fleet is gone." He stood with his great plates bristling and his empty hands flat on the desk, a soldier announcing the death of soldiers to a room of civilians who had voted him half the ships he had asked for. 3 budgets running. 12 days ago I told this chamber the rim line would hold until winter. I retract my testimony. The rim line does not exist. There is now no organized force between the Ascendancy's van and the Tessera approaches but distance, and the Ascendancy is eating the distance. Into the stillness after that, with the timing of a creature that has rehearsed, rose the Celt envoy. I had marked him the first day. A tall figure alone at the observer's desk, the Concord, in its exquisite procedural fairness, grants even to the power currently burning its rim, because the Concord was negotiating with the Ascendancy too, in parallel, through this same envoy, and half the chamber pretended not to know it. His name was Skarn Ul. The Celt are a handsome species. If you find leverage handsome, tall, narrow, sheathed in dark ceremonial lamellar, with still faces and beautiful diction in any tongue they bother to learn. The Concord grieves, and the Ascendancy grieves with it, Ul said, with the harmonics of a creditor. Thaloran need not be repeated. My principal's terms remain open, and remain, in my respectful submission, the only realistic instrument before this chamber. His still face turned, deliberately, toward the petitioner's rail, toward me, and the chamber turned with it. Unless the Concord proposes to be rescued by its fence ghosts. We have heard the rumor in the corridors. The contained species come back through the wire to save its keepers. He let his gaze rest on me the way you rest a hand on a small animal. The Ascendancy's survey of the human volume is more current than the Concord. Madam, we know what is behind your fence. Spare these worthies the theater. I did not stand. I looked at him from where I sat, an old woman with her hands folded, and I gave him the only sentence he was owed. Your survey is also wrong, envoy, I said. But yours is wrong in a way you will not enjoy. He smiled with everything but his eyes and sat, and the speaker's chime carried us mercifully into recess, and the chamber emptied upward into its 100 corridor conspiracies. I stayed at the rail. I think best these days in empty rooms that once frightened me. Val came down to the floor alone, without her clerks, which was the bravest thing I had yet seen a Concord officer do that week. Up close, the speaker looked the way commanders look in the photographs taken the day before surrenders. Immaculate, hollowed, awake too many days. Sequira, she said quietly. I counted the hands 40 years ago. It was my desk that certified the tally. I remember you, I said. You counted twice. Something crossed the pale luminous face, there and gone. I have spent a career telling myself a clerk certifies what the chamber decides. That the hands were not mine. They weren't, I said. Your hands were busy. I watched them. They were holding the count, and they were steady, and the count was true. That is not a small thing in this hall, Speaker. It may shortly be the only thing in this hall the Compact trusts. She was silent a moment. Above us, the dome held its hard blue, empty. What is behind the cordon, Ambassador? She asked, plainly, one professional to another, the question her own directorate could not bring itself to ask in public. An answer, I said, to a letter your predecessor should never have had to send. I will not unwrap it in a corridor whisper, Val, and I will not have it leak out of me in pieces to be discounted piece by piece. The chamber voted with its hands in the open. It will learn with its eyes in the open. You're choreographing us, she said. There was no resentment in it. She was a tally clerk by nature, naming the things she counted. I am keeping order in a proceeding, I said. Someone in this building ought to. She almost smiled. Then she told me the things she had truly come down to the floor to say, in a voice pitched for one pair of human ears. The Brel delegation requested a closed audience with you tonight. Before you answer them, ask yourself why a trade league with no official knowledge of human space has spent 2 days too frightened to look at you. She went back up to the bench. Anders raised an eyebrow at me across the credential case. The manifests, he said. The manifests, I agreed. 40 years is a long time. An offense is only offense, and the Brel, whatever the rolls recorded, whatever the chamber pretended, the Brel had been climbing through ours since the paint on it was still wet. Somewhere in this gleaming city, in ledgers kept off the registry, lived 4 decades of receipts that put the lie to every chart the directorate had shown the chamber that morning. The Concord did not know what was behind its cordon, but the Concord's bankers did, and the bankers were sweating. The Brel came to my quarters that night the way money always comes, late, soft-footed, and convinced that every room is a back room if you close the door politely enough. There were 3 of them, trade masters of the Inner League, round amber-eyed creatures in merchant gray whose species has weathered every war in conquered history by the simple method of provisioning both sides. Their senior, Trade Master Helic Vor, had brought a gift, a bottled cordial from a Brel vineyard world, and an offer he was at pains to call a framework. The framework was this. The Brel League would recognize the Meridian Compact immediately, unilaterally, ahead of the Concord itself. Brel Capital would champion Earth's cause in the chamber. Brel votes, and the Brel hold the proxies of a dozen small indebted species would smooth every procedural path. And in exchange, the compact would agree that certain historical commerce, certain irregular manifests, certain 40-year accumulations of quiet mutual benefit need never burden the public record. The past is a warehouse, Ambassador, Vor said, turning his little cordial glass. Nothing in it improves with display. You've been in our warehouse, Trade Master, I said. You know exactly how things keep. He smiled at that, the way bankers smile when they think a deal has begun. He was wrong. I had sat across from better than him in 100 compartments on both sides of the cordon, and I held the compact's first law where he could not reach it. We do not whisper. Whispering is what you do when the room's judgment matters more than the record. I had stopped caring about this room's judgment on a particular afternoon 40 years prior, at approximately the moment the count reached 100. Here's what the compact offers the Brel League, I said. Tomorrow in open session you will be asked about the manifests, not by me, I am a guest. By your own chamber, because I will place one question before the speaker, and the speaker will be procedurally obliged to put it, and once it is put, the Korath will pull the threads, because pulling threads is the Korath's whole liturgy. When that happens, the League can be discovered, or the League can disclose. The first costs you everything. The second costs you an evening's pride. You have until the chime. Vor's amber eyes went flat. We came offering friendship. You came offering a conspiracy, I said. We've had your friendship for 40 years, Trade Master. We paid freight on it. The cordial you may leave. They left it. Merchants always leave the gift. It converts a defeat into a delivery. The next morning I placed my question. It was 11 words long, addressed to the bench, written out in advance in Anders' careful hand so the interpreters could not soften a syllable of it. Will the chamber establish how the Concord's own commerce has crossed the cordon? And the morning after that, because Helic Vor was many low things but never once a fool, the Brel League rose in open session and disclosed. I will not rehearse the whole of it. It took 4 hours, and the chamber sat through every minute with the rigid stillness of a family hearing a will read. What the League's ledgers showed, summarized without mercy by the Korath archivist Kelvam, who had waited his entire archival life, I believe, for a morning of this exact flavor, was 40 years of trade through a fence the Concord believed sealed, Brel hulls flagged as survey ships, transfer points and dead systems off every chart, a volume of commerce that began in the first Exiled decade as smuggled medicines and seed stock moving inward to a quarantined species, and then, by the second decade, turned, reversed, began to flow the other way. Item, Kelvam read, 4 hands sorting 4 threads of ledger at once, his dry voice filling the dome. Year 19 of the closure. Inbound to Concord space via League carrier, forged structural alloy, human manufacture 11,000 tons. Item, year 22, gravitic field cores, human manufacture quantity 400, purchased at premium. Item, year 26, medical synthesis templates, human design, licensed. The ledger says, the League paying royalties to a human registry, for sale on 90 Concord worlds under Brel mark. He looked up into the tiers. The Directorate's assessment described an industrial index it rated as modest. Honored delegates for 30 years by these ledgers, this chamber's own hospitals have been running on it. The sound the chamber made then was not panic. Panic came later, and I will tell it plainly when it comes. This was lower than panic, the sound of 200 delegations simultaneously reviewing every assumption their governments had filed under settled, the rustle and click and breath of a body discovering that the specimen jar had been trading with the kitchen for decades, through the bankers, at a profit, while the house slept soundly on its certainties. In the observer's desk, Skarn Ull of the Celt had stopped lounging. Counselor Ethiv attempted repair. He rose with his harmonics arranged and proposed that the disclosures, while regrettable in form, in substance confirmed the wisdom of reinstatement. See how naturally human industry already served conquered needs. How much more fruitful, formalized under proper supervision. It was well done in its way. A lesser chamber might have taken the rope he threw. Kelvam took the floor instead. Archivists are the only delegates in that hall who fear nothing, because everyone owes the rolls and the rolls owe no one. Before the chamber supervises anything, the old Korath said, the rolls require a fact. The credential seal at the petitioner's rail names a polity, and the League's ledgers in their latter years name it too. The same polity, honored delegates paid as a counterparty in treaty-grade instruments by our own bankers who do not pay treaty-grade instruments to 9 systems of quarrelsome colonists. The rolls therefore put the question the Directorate has not put. He turned his four-handed bulk toward me, and his voice, for all its dryness, was respectful in the old way, registry to registry, clerk to clerk. Envoy of the Meridian Compact, for the record of this chamber. What is the Compact's registry? I looked at Anders. Anders looked at the bench, received the speaker's slow nod, and keyed the credential case. We had brought it prepared, of course. We had carried it 11 weeks, sealed under 3 authentications, formatted to the Concord's own archival standards by Compact clerks who had studied those standards the way gunners study a range table. Because the Compact was founded by people this chamber taught, in one catastrophic afternoon, that records are weapons, and the side that controls the record controls the verdict. The registry rose into the dome in cyan light, projected by the hall's own systems, indexed, sourced, auditable, and it replaced the Directorate's little candle chart of 9 systems with the truth. 311 settled systems. The chamber saw the map of the volume beyond the cordon, not the cupped hand they had drawn, but the open territories beyond it, the dark they had never surveyed because the fence faced inward, and their curiosity stopped at their own wire. Settlement chains running outward like river systems. Orbital yards at 11 named anchorages. Population of the Compact, all member species 58 billion. Member species, the index noted, plural, humanity and the Avith, and the Colin, 2 peoples this chamber had never met, found out in the deep by the exiles, federated by charter, holding seats in an assembly the Concord had not known existed, under a constitution whose first article Kelvam now read aloud into a silence you could have stood a spear in. No member of the Compact, he read, shall be expelled, contained, or judged in absence. Every accused shall stand before the body that weighs them. The old archivist let the projection burn above the hall for a long moment. Cyan light on 200 tiers of faces, pale and plated and amber-eyed, every one of them doing the same arithmetic at the same time, 40 years, 1 vote, a show of hands. And on the far side of their fence, while their watch stations were consolidated and their census aged into fiction, the species they had sealed in a jar had built a federation larger than the room that sealed it. The rolls, Kelvam said at last, gently, like a physician closing a chart, will require some days to amend the registry. The speaker's chime was almost kind. It was Drosk who broke the recess before it could form. Drosk, the soldier, whose dead at Cassiv and Theleron were still being counted while the civilians around him discovered cartography. He came down from the Skenark onto the open floor itself, which War Masters do not do, and he faced me across the petitioner's rail with his gray plates flat and his ruined chain still lying on his desk above. And he asked the only question that had ever mattered to him in his life. Those yards, he said, 11 anchorages, hulls of war, envoy. How many and how fast can they reach the Tessera approaches? That is levy talk, War Master, Counselor Thieve interjected smoothly from the high seats, smelling the danger. The service of member fleets is a matter for the instrument of reinstatement, which remains before the chamber. We are not members, I said. Quiet, flat, final. The sentence I had been sent 11 weeks to deliver at the moment it would carry farthest, and it carried. Ethieve's harmonics died in his throat. The tears did not rustle this time. They had run out of rustle. I looked up at Drosk, soldier to old woman, the only honest creature on that floor, and I gave him what I had not given the committee, because his dead had earned it and their dignity had not. But we received your chamber's letter, War Master, I said, and the Compact answers its letters. What it will not do is answer them on a leash. The terms under which our hulls move are not mine to whisper and not this committee's to draft. They will be stated in this hall in open session when one prior matter is concluded. What matter, Dross said, could possibly be prior? Above us, the registry of the Meridian Compact still hung in the dome's light, Article 1st, where the whole chamber could read it. Every accused shall stand before the body that weighs them. The Concord has an unfinished proceeding, I said. 40 years ago, this body tried a species in absence and sentenced it by a show of hands. The Compact does not negotiate with that chamber. Convene a better one, and we will talk about the sky. It took the Concord 3 days to understand what I had asked for, and a 4th to begin being afraid of it. The first reading was the generous one. The humans want an apology. Chambers know how to apologize. It is among their cheapest products. By the second morning, Ethieve's committee had drafted a statement of profound regret. 4 pages, exquisitely harmonized, expressing the Concord's sorrow at the sufferings occasioned by the closure while attributing those sufferings to the era, to circumstances, to the climate of the times, to every author, in short, except the 220 delegations whose hands had gone up in the open air of this room, while a younger Vol counted them twice. The statement was transmitted to my quarters for review, as a courtesy. I sent it back within the hour, unannotated, with a single line beneath the signature block, and I confessed the line had been 40 years in the drafting. The compact has no use for the Concorde's sorrow. It requires the Concorde's record, because that was the demand, and there was nothing soft in it. Not an apology, not a ceremony. The proceeding itself. Session 4471 of the Concord of Aligned Stars, the trial and absence of the human species, reconvened under its original docket. The original motion read again, aloud, by the office that read it then. The original minutes entered whole into the open record with every name and the motion put again to a show of hands in daylight under the dome with the accused this time standing in the well of the hall. Annul it or affirm it. The compact would treat with whatever chamber stood on the far side of that vote. But it would not sign so much as a freight schedule with a body that kept the old verdict living in its rolls while it begged the convicted for a fleet. You asked the Concord to put itself on trial, Ethieve said in open session when the demand was formally docketed. No, Counselor, I said. I ask it to finish the one it started. Your chamber convicted us in an afternoon. We are asking for a vote, not a war. Of the two parties at this rail, only one of us has ever confused those. The panic when it came did not look like shouting. In that hall, panic is procedural. It looked like the Iliath block demanding referral to the Committee on Precedent, where demands go to die of old age. Like the indebted species who held Brel proxies abstaining from even scheduling votes, their bankers suddenly silent. Like Councillor Ethieve discovering reasons the original minutes of Session 4471 were sealed under privacy statutes. Statutes? Kelvam noted from the rolls with lethal blandness. Enacted 11 years after the session, they were now said to protect. It looked like delegations who had spent 3 days calling me the envoy of salvation calling me, on the fourth day, an extortionist with a fleet. And under all of it, audible to anyone who had spent a lifetime listening to chambers, ran the true fear, not of the humiliation which fades, but of the precedent. If a verdict of this hall could be reopened because the convicted grew strong, then no verdict of this hall was ever final. And if the names in the minutes could be read aloud 40 years later to a room that had changed its mind, then every raised hand in every future session would weigh, and the easy unanimities by which empires of procedure live would never be easy again. They were not defending the old vote. Most of them privately despised it. They were defending the sweetness of voting without remembering. I knew it. I let them feel me knowing it. On the fourth day, the Concorde's authority began leaking out of the building, and it leaked toward me, which served nothing I wanted. It came in the persons of the Rim delegations, the governments in exile of Thelorin and the Vels worlds, peoples whose chambers were ash and whose fleets were entries in Drock's casualty rolls. They arrived at my quarters at dawn, 11 delegates in mourning colors, and their senior, a burned world matriarch named Ossel Crane of Theloran, set their petition on my table with both hands. They were done with the Concord, she said. Done with the committees that had voted them half a defense and the bankers who had financed both sides of their ruin. They asked the compact for protectorate status, direct, bilateral, behind the Concord's back in the Concord's own capital, while the Concord's own session sat. It was the most dangerous document of the whole embassy, and the most tempting, and I want the record to show both honestly. 11 rim systems offering themselves freely would have handed the compact a foothold this side of the cordon that no treaty could ever have extracted. There were voices in our own assembly that would have taken it before the ink dried, and it would have proved, to every suspicious mind in that hall, that the humans had come back through the wire to do exactly what the closure's authors always swore we would, to pull the Concord apart at grieving seams and carry off the pieces. The compact will not receive this petition in this city, I told her. Not because your peoples are not owed, they are owed by everyone in the system, my own included. Because if I take it, matriarch, I become what that chamber voted me 40 years ago, one day before I proved the vote wrong. I slid the document back across the table, and then I gave her the only thing I lawfully could. Asylum is another matter. Asylum is not politics. It is an old human reflex. Any hull of yours that reaches a cordon gate will find it open, and no one on our side will ask your people for anything but their names. That standing order is older than this war. It does not expire when the cameras leave. Crane of Thelorin looked at the return petition for a long moment. They told us humans bargain hard. She said, we do, I said. Wait until you see what we charge the strong. Ethieve had the story by midday. His committee leaked like a hull off Cassiv, and he rose in afternoon session to accuse the compact of suborning member governments, which was bold arithmetic for a man whose block had spent the morning drafting annotations to its own cowardice. I let Val's procedure deal with most of it. When the bench finally invited my response, I gave the chamber the entire correspondence, unredacted, transmitted to the rolls while Ethieve was still mid-harmonic, the petition, my refusal, the asylum order, And then I stood for the first time that day. The compact was offered 11 of your systems yesterday, I said. It declined them. Note the date, counselor. Your chamber has 5 days to demonstrate it was worth declining for. The Korath tears made the dry rasping that passes among them for applause, and the proxies stared at me as if I had refused a continent which I had. And somewhere high in the gallery, the feeds of 40 species carried the sentence out to a galaxy that had been told for 40 years what humans were. Let them reconcile it. That was the work now. Every day, one more certainty dismantled, one more file that would not close. On the 5th day, the war voted with us. Vel's Crossing fell. The Fortress Junction, the Concord's remaining strategists had built every surviving plan around, and it fell in a day and a night, and after it there was no plan, only the arithmetic of distance and the ascendancy's appetite. The refugee convoys began arriving in the Tessera system itself. Not dispatches now, not couriers, but hulls visible from the capital's own orbitals, crammed lifeboats from member worlds the Concord had sworn collectively to defend, and every delegation in that chamber had kin or constituents or creditors aboard them. That was the morning Skarn Ull overplayed. The Celt envoy rose at the observer's desk, beautiful and unhurried, and informed the chamber that the ascendancy, in light of developments, was tabling its final terms. He read them. They were not occupation, he was at pains to note. The Concord would persist, its chamber, its roles, its flags. It would simply persist as what he called an aligned tributary. Its yards under ascendancy management, its rim provinces ceded outright, its fleet capped by treaty, its foreign relations conducted through Kel. The Concord of aligned stars would be permitted to keep its name and its beautiful room, the way a house keeps its portraits after the bank takes the deed. The offer stands for 19 days, Ulla said, and his still face turned once more toward the petitioner's rail, because he could not help himself, and he wanted the chamber to see him do it. I am instructed to add that my principal's offer is not contingent on theater. The ascendancy negotiates with realities, the fence ghosts, whatever ledgers they have purchased, and whatever maps they project in borrowed light, have produced in this hall precisely one envoy, one aide, and one demand for a seance over a 40-year-old vote. If that is the rescue, honored delegates, the ascendancy invites the Concord to be rescued. If it appears, my principals will be fascinated to meet it. He sat down well pleased with himself, and he had every right to be. It was flawlessly delivered. It was also, by my count, the single most useful speech given in the Hall of the Aligned that decade, and I have never decided whether to be grateful to him. Fear of the Celt had hung over the chamber for a season, formless, a weather. Ull had just given it terms, a deadline and a sneer, and chambers like species discover their spines at the precise moment contempt is read to them aloud from a prepared text. In the silence after the Celt sat, old Chancellor Serain Tev rose for the first time, and the hall held its breath because the author had stood. I should speak of Tev with the precision he is owed. The Iliath live long. He had been Chancellor 40 years ago, the first name in the minutes, the hand that drafted the motion of closure and the voice that moved it, and he was ancient now, even by the measure of his kind. A tall stooped figure gone translucent at the edges, the luminous skin dimmed to gray glass. Attended by 2 clerks who carried his archive cases like reliquaries, he had sat through every session since my return, high in the Iliath arc, silent, watching me the way the past watches. Half the chamber assumed he would die before the question of his motion reached him. I had wondered, privately, if he was waiting for it. For 60 years, Tev said, and his voice was a ruin with the bones of beauty in it, I have been the Concord's memory. Permit me to perform the office once more. The clerks lifted no documents. He needed none. I moved the closure. I drafted the words this body is now begged and bullied to reread. The envoy at the rail walked out of my proceeding without speaking, and I recorded in my own annex that her silence proved the species' contempt for law. His dimmed eyes found me, down the long light of the hall. I have had 40 years to consider that annex. I have considered little else. Honored delegates, I will not pretend my motion was anything but fear. We were a 1,000-year house, and they were a fire we did not set and could not regulate, and I persuaded 220 delegations that a fire can be contained if you wall it from its fuel. The wall has now been surveyed. The chamber may assess for itself how the containment fared. A sound moved through the tears, not quite laughter, the bitter cousin of it. But understand what you are being asked before your hands move a second time in this matter. The envoy does not ask the Concord to repent. Repentance is private. It costs a chamber nothing. She asks the Concord to re-enter its own record, to stand where the accused stood, knowing that this time the votes will be counted by a power that can enforce the tally. It is the most dangerous gift this body has ever been offered. The ruined voice did not rise. The hall bent toward it. It is also the only proceeding on the docket that can make the Concord worth saving. The ascendancy offers to buy the house. The compact offers to make the House answer for itself. 1,000-year House delegates. I know which offer is the insult. He gathered his robes to sit and paused and finished, dry as the rolls themselves. The Committee on Precedent may also note that the author of the motion does not oppose its rereading. There. 60 years of my obstruction, withdrawn in a sentence. The chamber has no procedural shelter left. I built them all. He sat. The chamber erupted. Ethives block on its feet. The proxies clamoring, the speaker's chime ringing against the noise like rain against a flood. Through it all, I stood at the rail and said nothing, because there was nothing left for me to add. The oldest enemy of my species had just spent the last of his authority clearing the road to his own judgment, and no sentence of mine could improve on the sight. It went to the bench at dusk. Vol sat alone above the storm with the iron collar catching the dome's last light, and when the hall finally quieted because it had exhausted every alternative to quieting, she ruled, in the flat certifying voice of the tally clerk she had never stopped being. The demand of the Meridian Compact is properly before this body. Session 4471 stands reconvened in 9 days. The original docket, the original motion. The minutes will be read entire a breath. Order of the bench. The reading will be conducted under the dome, in full session, with the gallery open. This chamber voted in the open once. It will not discover shame as a procedure now. The chime sounded a single cold note and it was done. That night, for the first time since my return, I slept without dreaming of the count. 9 days. The fleet, by the navigation advisories Anders filed daily with Tessera Control, openly correctly in the Concorde's own forms, where any clerk who troubled to read them could have seen what was coming, was 8 days out. I had told no lies in that chamber. I had simply let the Concorde keep its habit of not reading its own paperwork. There would be time later to wonder which of us that reflected on worse. The 9 days before the session were the strangest of my long life, and I include in the comparison the day a Concorde summons crossed the cordon addressed to a country it did not know had become an empire. The capital could not decide what I was. The news feeds of 40 species tried out titles for me the way tailors try cloth. The returned, the petitioner, fence queen, the auditor. Crowds gathered along the processional route between my quarters and the hall, not hostile, not warm, just watching, the way you watch weather that has come back after wrecking your grandparents. 3 governments in exile from fallen rim worlds petitioned me for asylum beyond the cordon, in writing, which would have been unthinkable a month before and which I forwarded to the Compact's assembly without comment, because it was not unthinkable to us at all. We had been a government in exile once. We kept the forms on file. A thief spent the 9 days doing what procedure does when it is cornered. He amended. If the vote could not be stopped, it could be upholstered. His committee produced in series a motion of contextual annotation, by which the chamber would reread the closure while attaching an explanatory preamble, a motion of bifurcated consideration, splitting the vote into a deploring of effects and a respecting of intentions, and at the last, with the candor of exhaustion, a private offer delivered to Anders in a corridor, annulment guaranteed, unanimity arranged, if the compact would accept the count being taken by recorded ballot instead of the lifting of hands. Dignity in exchange for the substance, the oldest trade in the building. I gave my whole answer to all of it in 4 words and let Anders carry them the motion, as written, because the hands were the point, not the cruelty of the symmetry, the meaning of it. A recorded ballot is an institution acting. A show of hands is 220 separate bodies deciding, each in its own skin in front of all the others, with no procedure to hide inside. That is what they had done to us. Each of them, severally in the open, had looked at a species and raised a hand. The compact was not asking the Concorde to amend a document. It was asking every delegation in that room to perform, in daylight, the physical act of choosing and to learn what we had learned watching them the first time, that a hand in the air is the heaviest object a civilization lifts. On the 4th day, the matter of the 6 came into the open, and it did not come from me. It came from the rolls. Kelvam, authenticating the original minutes for the rereading, had done what archivists do, which is read the appendices. And in the appendices of session 4471, he had found the dissent register, the 6 delegations that voted no, and Korath, being incapable of leaving a thread unpulled, he had cross-indexed those 6 names against 40 years of subsequent record. He brought his findings to open session himself, 4 hands trembling slightly, which in a Korath is the equivalent of another species weeping openly. The 6 who had voted against the exile of Earth, the Aveni, the Colin-Su, cousins in trade to the Colin we would later charter, the galaxy being small in ways no chamber ever maps, the Odri, the Pelix Shoals, the Ver, and the Senate Remnant. 6 small species, client peoples, the poor seats of the 3rd circle, with nothing to gain from defying the Iliath block and no protection after they did. The minutes recorded that their dissent was noted. The minutes did not record what followed, but the rolls cross-index did. The slow administrative winter that closed over all 6 in the years after the vote. Contracts unrenewed, survey priority withdrawn. Loans called by Brell syndicates with exquisite timing. Not a policy, never a policy. Merely 214 delegations, each independently finding the 6 slightly less convenient to remember. Chambers do not punish. They forget with precision. And then Kelvam read the other column, the one that had cost him his composure. Across the same 40 years, in the trade records the Brell disclosure had cracked open, ran a current of quiet transactions threading through dead systems to exactly those 6 peoples and no others. Grain futures honored after the buyers defaulted, by counterparties who never pressed. Medical templates licensed at fees later found refunded to the decimal. A Pellic shoal fleet, crippled by a reactor blight in the lean years, retrofitted at yards no register could place, on credit no ledger could find, repaid, the Pellic insisted on repaying, to an account that channeled every unit. Kelvam had traced it into a scholarship trust for Aveni navigators. 40 years. The convicted species, sealed behind its fence, had found the 6 hands that rose for it and had never once let them fall, and had never said so. Had built no monument, sought no credit, attached no condition, had kept it so quiet that the beneficiaries themselves had only suspicions, freighter tale rumors, the recurring kindness of strangers with human-built engines. The rolls offer no motion, Kelvam said into the dome's silence when the last item was read. The rolls observe only this: for 40 years, this chamber has held that the species beyond the cordon was constitutionally incompatible with the Concord's peace. He closed his cases, all 4 hands at once. The rolls have now audited both parties' conduct toward the helpless. The chamber may sit with the comparison. In the 3rd circle, small and gray at her poor desk, Mir of the Aveni wept, hands pressed flat to her breastbone and made no sound at all. I said nothing that day. There are days when an envoy's entire duty is to remain seated and let the record do the work the record was built for. But that evening I went up the long stair to the 3rd circle myself, an old woman climbing past 200 emptying desks, and I sat down beside Mir in the cheap seats among the small peoples, where the view of the dome is worst and the acoustics swallow your speeches before they reach the floor. And we did not talk about the vote at all. We talked about navigation. Her grandniece, it happens, holds the compact scholarship this cycle. She wants to fly the deep survey routes, out past the anchorages, where the charts are still being born. She asked me. Mir said, why humans chart so far beyond their own borders? I never know what to tell her. Tell her it's an old habit, I said. We learned the hard way what happens to peoples who let someone else hold the only map. On the 6th day, the Concorde caught 11 of its own delegations selling the house. It was Drosk who caught them. The Sken had been reading the Celt legation's courier traffic since the spring. Illegally, he informed the chamber without a flicker. Under war powers the committee had granted in panic and forgotten to rescind. And what his signals, officers decrypted on the 6th morning, was a communique from inside the hall of the Aligned itself. 11 delegations, all of them proxies pledged through Brell syndicates, all of them carrying debts the war had made unpayable, had transmitted to Envoy Skarn Ul a confidential instrument of intent. Should the rereading of Session 4471 fail, or the human terms prove unacceptable, the undersigned would move immediate acceptance of the Ascendancy's tribute offer and deliver the votes to carry it. They had attached as evidence of seriousness a draft schedule for the transfer of the rim yards. They had signed it with their formal seals. Drosk read the entire intercept into the record in his graveside voice, seal by seal, and the hall came apart in a way I had not seen it come apart yet. Not procedure this time, not rustling, but the raw vertigo of a body discovering the rot inside its own wall. 2 of the 11 tried denial and were destroyed by their own seals within minutes. The rest sat in a silence that admitted everything. At the observer's desk, Skarn Uli examined his perfect hands and did not trouble to look embarrassed. Leverage is never embarrassed, and the communique had cost him nothing but the reading of his mail. Vol came down from the bench, physically came down, the iron collar swinging, the first time in the embassy I saw her leave it, and stood on the open floor before the 11, and the tally clerk's voice filled the dome without any amplification at all. You will not be expelled, she said. Expulsion is what this chamber does when it wants to stop thinking. You will sit through the rereading. You will hear the minutes entire, with the rest of us. And when the hands are called, yours will rise or not rise in the sight of the gallery, the rolls, the accused, and the peoples you have just tried to sell. And whatever your hands do, the record will hold your souls beside your votes, forever, in the same file. The Concorde is done forgetting with precision. Resume your seats. It was the finest thing I ever saw her do, and it was not done for me. But it answered a question I had been carrying for 11 weeks, sealed deeper than the treaty case. The question the Compact's assembly had charged me to answer before committing a single hull. Whether anything lived in that chamber worth allying with. Whether the body that begged us was the body that exiled us wearing a frightened face, or something that could still stand up inside its own ruins and choose. Anders found me looking, I suppose, strange that evening. "You're pleased," he said, in the tone of a man who had learned to read the difference between my silences. 11 delegations just tried to sell the Concorde to the enemy, and you're pleased. 11 tried to sell it, I said. 200 watched their speaker refuse to let them hide. 40 years ago, the count ran the other way. I closed the day's dispatches. Empires are not saved by their innocence, Anders. They haven't any. They are saved, when they are saved at all, by whether the room can still be ashamed. Write the assembly. Tell them the room can still be ashamed. On the 7th day, War Master Drosk read the paperwork. I had wondered who would, and I had hoped it would be him. The navigation advisories Anders filed daily with Tessera Control were public instruments, correctly formatted, sitting the traffic registry like letters in an unwatched rack, notice of inbound transit, Meridian Compact flag, escort category, arrival window, approach corridor. The civilians never looked. Civilians read summaries. Drosk was a soldier missing 2 fleets, and soldiers read traffic. He came to my quarters at dusk without ceremony, alone, carrying a printed flimsy in one gray fist, and he put it on the table between us and set one blunt claw on the line that had stopped him, escort category. The Concorde's traffic forms, drafted in a more innocent century, classify escorts by hull count in bands, and the highest band on the form, set down by some long-dead clerk who never imagined needing more, reads 40+. The advisory said 40+, it had said 40+ every day for a week. "How far past 40, Drosk said, does the plus go?" "The form doesn't ask," I said. We answered the form. He stood very still, plates flat, working it the way a war master works a contact report that changes the whole board. "At Cassiv," he said at last, "we broke ourselves on the Ascendancy's van. 206 hulls of the line, and we put 31 of theirs on the bottom of the dark. And they called the exchange acceptable and kept coming. I have spent a season explaining to civilians what that arithmetic means. They hear the numbers. They do not hear them." His eyes came up from the flimsy. "Will yours hear them, Envoy? When your terms are stated in that hall, whatever they are, whoever bends, the Ascendancy will still be eating the distance. Treaties do not stop a tide. I require to know, before that chamber spends its remaining days on history, whether what is coming up that corridor is a gesture." For 40 years, the Compact had answered that species chamber with silence and short sentences, and the discipline holds, and I would carry it to the session and past it. But there is a register between governments and another between soldiers, and Drosk had set his chain down on his desk in front of his own dead, and I judged, my last discretionary act of an 11-week embassy, that he had standing the committee never earned. "At Cassiv, the Ascendancy showed 290 hulls, I said. "That is their van war master, not their strength, and you know it. Their strength is perhaps 1,100, committed across 9 fronts. The advisory in your hand describes the escort of a treaty embassy." I let that sit exactly one breath. The Compact keeps its strength where the Concorde has kept its census takers all these years. Behind the wire. Out of sight. You are owed 1 number tonight for your dead, and I will give you the only one that matters. Of the 2 fleets converging on this system, the Ascendancy's is the smaller. And the Ascendancy's intelligence, unlike the Concorde's, has known it for a year. Why do you suppose Envoy Ul's principals have spent a season hammering at your rim, War Master, instead of probing 1 centimeter past our cordon? They went around us. The whole war is the Ascendancy going around us. Drosk looked at the flimsy for a long time. The plates along his shoulders moved once, slowly, and settled. The skin gesture I learned afterward, that their soldiers make at a graveside when the watch changes and the dead are relieved of duty. 9 hours of Thelerin, he said quietly. 12 days of Vel's Crossing. And the answer was behind the fence the whole time, growing, because my chamber put it there. He folded the flimsy with the precision of a man folding a flag. "I will be in the hall for the rereading, Envoy. The Sken will lift no hand for the old motion. We ask one thing in exchange for what is left of our pride, name it. When your terms are read," Drosk said, "let a soldier read the military annex, not the harmonized ones, not the bankers. Someone in that room should say the numbers like they cost something." On the 8th night, the eve of the session, Val sent no message and Ethiv sent 3, each more conciliatory than the last, and I answered none of them, and stood at my window a long while, watching the lights of the refugee hulls in high orbit. The visible dead of every comfortable vote ever taken, under that dome, and the sky above Vale Tessera was still empty and would be empty for 1 more day, and I thought about hands. 220 of them, 40 years ago, in the bright air, and mine in my coat pockets, shaking, going down the long aisle while the count was certified at 214 for, 6 against, and the species I served became a specimen by procedure of a body that called itself the piece of the galaxy. Tomorrow the same motion would be read to the same room by the same ruined voice that wrote it. I did not need the Concord to absolve us. I needed something colder and more useful, the thing the compact had sent me 11 weeks to collect. I needed the record corrected by the same instrument that had broken it. Hands in daylight counted true. They reconvened session 4471 on a morning of hard blue weather, and for the first time since my return there was not an empty seat in the hall of the aligned. The missing delegations had come back for it, the Rim peoples in mourning colors, the governments in exile seated by special order of the bench, the proxies recalled from whatever discretion the Brel had purchased them into. The public gallery, opened by Val's ruling, was filled before dawn, and the overflow stood in the processional galleries 10 deep. Species who had never shared a corridor pressed shoulder to carapace to watch a chamber do a thing no chamber in Concord history had ever done. Stand where it had once made another stand. I took the well of the hall at the petitioner's rail. Anders set the credential case at my left hand, and at my right, by formal instrument of the compact's assembly, transmitted under seal during the night. He set a second case, sealed in dark alloy, which neither of us opened, the terms. Drafted not by me but by the assembly of 3 species across 2 years of debate against this day, in the hope the Concord would earn the opening of it. The steward of the rolls read the convening order, original docket, original motion, and then, because the bench had ordered the minutes read entire, Kelvam rose, and the hall of the Alliance spent 4 hours listening to itself. I had lived it once and read it 100 times, and still I had not understood what it would do to that room to hear it aloud. The minutes of session 4471 are not monstrous. That is what is unbearable about them. They are ordinary, procedural motions, seconded and carried. A luncheon recess. The strategic assessment of the day, confident in its errors, projecting human expansion curves that the chamber found alarming, and that the compact, real history had since trebled. Counselor after counselor resigned to say measured, harmonized, reasonable things about regrettable necessity. The Brel delegation's statement of neutrality, 11 words long, from a league whose hidden ledgers were already 4 years deep in human trade. The Aveni dissent, Mir's predecessor, a voice dead 30 years now, asking the chamber in plain unharmonized Concord tongue, if they are dangerous now, what will they be after 40 years of our fear? You are not voting on what they are. You are voting on what they will remember. The minutes record that the chamber laughed. Kelvam read it as written, because the bench had ordered the record entire. The observation of the Aveni delegate is noted. Laughter in the hall. He read those 4 words and stopped, 4 hands flat on the lectern, and the silence that followed lasted longer than the laughter had. And in the third circle, the small gray delegation sat like stones, and somewhere high in the Iliothark, a counselor covered her face with both luminous hands. They heard their own voices that morning, the ones still living. That was the mechanism, and I will not pretend I had not built the day to produce it. 11 of the delegates of session 4471 still held their seats. The minutes named each speaker as protocol required, and so 11 times that morning, an aged delegate sat in the full sight of the gallery and listened to a younger self being reasonable about a species caging, measured words read, back across 40 years into a room that now knew everything those words had been wrong about, while the descendants of the laughed at Aveni sat in the cheap seats with their hands in their laps, having spent the interval being kept alive in secret by the people this chamber had voted into the dark. Ethiv, to his credit, and I weigh the words, because he had been my adversary through every day of that embassy, did not hide. The minutes held him at length, a long, graceful, deadly intervention in favor of closure, the speech that had swayed the middle block. When Kelvam's reading reached it, Ethiv rose at his desk and stood, unbidden, for the whole recitation of his own words, hands at his sides, harmonics silent, and when it was done he said only, "The record is accurate," and sat down. It was the first sentence he had spoken in 9 days that needed no translation in any of the hall's 200 tongues. And then the reading was done, and the dome held its light, and Serene Tev rose to perform his office. The 2 clerks helped him to the mover's lectern, which he had not stood at in 40 years, and he stood at it now translucent and ancient, the author at the end of authorship, and he read his own motion to the chamber that had once carried it for him, the motion of closure, whereas the human species demonstrates expansion incompatible with the equilibrium of the aligned stars, whereas containment is the mercy alternative to war. Be it moved that the human volume be sealed under cordon, its seat struck from the rolls, its species held apart from the commerce and councils of the Concord, until such time as this body in its wisdom shall reopen what it has closed. His voice did not break. It was worse than that. It was clear, and you could hear inside the ruin of it the orator of 60 years ago, the cadences built to carry a frightened chamber, and you could watch him hear it himself, each phrase coming back to its maker across the wreckage of every prediction it contained. He finished. He set the motion down, and then Serene Tev, chancellor of the closure, looked down the long well of the Hall of the Aligned at the woman his motion had sent into the dark, and he performed the only act of his life that the historians of two civilizations would agree on. The motion stands before the chamber, he said. I am its author, and by the forms the author speaks first to its merits. Honored delegates, I have served the Concord's record for 60 years. Hear its memory speak. Every clause I wrote has been refuted by the species it described, refuted not by their fleet, which any fool can build, but by 40 years of conduct towards 6 small peoples. No one in this room was watching. The motion's whereas was fear, its mercy was a wall, its wisdom was an empty sky. He gathered himself. The chamber did not breathe. The author speaks to the merits. The motion has none. I asked the chamber to put it to the vote, and I asked the galaxy's pardon that I cannot vote against it twice. Val's chime sounded once into the stillness. The motion of session 4471 is put again, the speaker said. The form is the form of its origin. The chamber will vote by show of hands. A pause, and then the tally clerk, who had counted twice 40 years ago, who wore the iron collar now, gave the instruction no one in that room would ever forget hearing. Those delegations affirming the closure of the human volume. Raise your hands now, in the sight of the accused, the gallery, and the rolls. In the well of the hall, I stood and turned slowly all the way around and looked at them. 226 delegations seated under the dome. Every face I will carry to my grave, the plated skin arc, the amber banks of the Brel, the luminous Iliath circles, the poor gray thirds, and over them the dome's blue morning, and through me, I will confess it here at the end of my life, the cold ghost of an afternoon 40 years deep, the forest of raised hands with no birds in it. Not one hand rose. Not thieves, not the proxies, not one trembling hedged half-lifted abstainers. The Hall of the Aligned sat under its dome with 226 delegations' hands flat upon their desks. In the longest minute of my 81 years, and the only sound was the gallery above us, 10 species deep, beginning, somewhere, very quietly, to weep. Those delegations rejecting the motion and striking the closure from the standing record of the Concord, Val said, and her certifying voice cracked at last on the fourth word and steadied, raise your hands now. I have no language for the sound 226 hands make. It is small. It is cloth and joint and air, a rustle, less noise than rain. I heard it with my back straight in the well of the room that had sentenced my species by the identical gesture, and I watched the forest rise again, every arc, every circle, every poor gray third-tier desk, Drosk's gray fist first of all of them and held highest, Mir's narrow hand trembling beside her grandniece's steady one, Ethieve's lifted unflinching, and last of all, assisted by his 2 clerks, both arms Serene Tev's, the tally of the bench, Fall said. Against the motion, 226. For the motion, none. Abstaining, none. She rose from the bench to read the certification standing, which speakers do only for instruments of state. By its own original form, in full session, in the sight of the rolls, the closure of the human volume is struck. The verdict of session 4471 is annulled at its root. The rolls will record, and here the tally clerk looked down into the well at me and finished the sentence in a voice that carried to the last tier of the gallery that the species was never what we voted. The record stands corrected. The chime sounded, and before the hall could find its voice, before relief could curdle into celebration, and the tears could begin the noise that chambers make to forgive themselves, I lifted my hand, one old human hand, raised at last in that room where human hands had no vote, and the silence came back like a tide obeying. I unsealed the dark alloy case. I took out the compact's terms, a single-bound instrument drafted by 3 species, 2 years in the writing, and I placed it on the petitioner's rail, where the accused had once stood to receive this chamber's judgment, and where this chamber would now receive ours. The Meridian Compact will treat with this Concord, I said. 8 words. The discipline held to the last. And the dome's light changed. It came on gradually, the way dawn comes, a shifting in the hard blue above the glass, a gathering, and then shape after shape after shape, resolving out of the high glare as the transit corridor Anders had filed in the public registry. Every day for 9 days in the Concord's own forms, delivered exactly what it had always said it would. The escort of a treaty embassy, arriving at the published window on the published approach. Hull after gray hull of the 1st Meridian Squadron, kilometer class in parade order, sliding silent and unhurried across the morning sky of Vale Tessera until the dome of the Hall of the Aligned held more warships than blue, 40 plus. As the form said, the plus going on and on and on past every craning, upturned, panicking, then not panicking face in the tears, the gallery surging to the rails, 226 delegations on their feet beneath the iron weight of the demonstrated answer, and not one shot offered, and not one demanded, and the fence ghost fleet wearing its running lights in broad daylight like a signature on a document. Drost did not look up at the ships for long, I noticed. He looked at them the way a professional looks, one sweep, counting, and then he looked across the chamber at the observer's desk, at Skarn Ul of the Celt Ascendancy, who was standing very still beneath the filled sky with the expression of an envoy revising, in real time, every dispatch he had ever sent home about ghosts. "Speaker," I said, into the iron hush, while the squadron's shadow moved tier by tier across the hall like the hand of a clock. "The compact's instrument is on the rail. Article 1 governs the sky above this world, and the chamber will wish to hear it before midday." I looked up once, at the gray hulls in the blue, my country 40 years grown, come back through the wire in parade order with its lights burning. "The War Master of the Sken has agreed to read the military annex. The numbers should be said by someone who knows their cost." They read the compact's instrument that afternoon under a dome that now had to be looked at twice. Once for the sky, once for what stood in it. Val ordered the session continuous. No delegation moved to recess. The steward of the rolls read the political articles, and Drosk of the Skin, by leave of the bench, read the military annex, and the chamber that had expected either vengeance or vassalage listened to a third thing it had no. File 4, which was a treaty between adults. Article 1, the sky. The 1st Meridian Squadron stood above Vale Tessera as the escort of an embassy and would depart as one. The compact claimed no station, no base, no berth in conquered space and wanted none. Article 2, the war. The compact's fleets would take the rim, not as levy, not as mercenaries, not under conquered joint command, but as a sovereign co-belligerent under its own flag and its own admirals by alliance freely signed between equals. Drosk read the force schedules in his graveside voice. The numbers that cost something, and I watched 200 delegations here, in the dry columns of hull counts and transit times, the size of the thing their predecessors had voted into the dark, and the size of the mercy that it had come back anyway. Article 3 was the one the historians argue about, so I will state it as the woman who carried it 11 weeks in a sealed case. The cordon stays, not their cordon ours. The line their fear once drew around us, the compact now drew for itself. A lawful border, gated, garrisoned from our side, crossed by treaty and by invitation. A thieves' bloc had assumed we would demand its erasure. The bankers had assumed we would sell crossings. The thieves had assumed we would tear it down on principle, in ceremony, with speeches. The chamber sat in perfect bafflement while the steward read the article that did none of it, and I let them be baffled, because the article was 40 years of the compact's soul written in boundary law, and souls do not harmonize. We had learned to live without them. That was the fact no chamber had filed. The wall they built in fear, we had finished in freedom, and on our side of it, we had built the thing their concord was supposed to have been. And a people that is done that does not abolish its border when it wins. It opens gates at its own hour on its own law to those who knock honestly. The fence becomes a wall, the wall becomes a border, and the border becomes the place where two civilizations meet standing up. The Celt Ascendancy's answer to the afternoon arrived before the evening chime, which told everyone with a professional eye that it had been drafted days in advance against exactly this contingency, whatever Skarn Ulla's speeches had claimed about ghosts. The Ascendancy proposed, in light of evolving regional architecture, a mutual de-escalation on the Tessera axis. By the second morning, the dispatches were coming in fleets worth. The van pulling back from the burned approaches, the siege trains gone from Velos Crossing in the night and off the rim anchorages, reported by a shaking Concorde picket captain, whose transmission, the bench played to the full chamber. Gray kilometer-class hulls in parade order, Meridian squadrons standing at the fallen stations, between the Ascendancy and everything it had been about to eat. They had been moving for weeks, of course, since before I reached Vale Tessera, since the hour the Compact's assembly voted my embassy its instructions. We had answered the Concord's letter before we finished reading it. Preparation is not a miracle. It is only what patience looks like from outside. Ull came to the petitioner's rail to take his leave, because the Kelter never crewed twice. "My principals," he said, "will want to know what the compact ultimately intends." "Tell them to read our treaties," I said. "We mean the words. It will be the strangest intelligence they gather this century." He studied me a long moment with that still face. The creditor meeting, for the first time, a counterparty with no debts, and then he bowed very slightly in the human style, and the Ascendancy went home around us once again. Before the signing, the compact sent down its witnesses, and the Concorde met the rest of us. They came from the flagship by ordinary shuttle, no honor flight, no announcement beyond a correctly filed docking request that this time every clerk in Tessera Control read twice. the co-envoys of the Meridian Compact, empowered as witnesses of charter to any instrument of state. Vel-Naru of the Othith came first up the long aisle, tall past any Iliath, narrow as a mast, robed against the painful brightness of planetary daylight, one of the drifting deep space people we had found in the second exile decade, starving in the cold between stars that no Concord survey had ever bothered to chart. And beside her, half her height and twice her width, came forewoman Dak of the Colin, a builder of the 11 anchorages, stone-gray and unimpressed, who looked up at the great dome of the Hall of the Aligned the way a master mason looks at someone else's vault, and audibly reserved judgment. The chamber stood for them. It had stood for me out of awe, which is cheap. It stood for these two out of something better earned. The slow comprehension, settling over 200 delegations at once, that the species they had sealed behind a wall for being unfit for fellowship had spent the wall years doing the one thing the verdict said we could not do, federating freely, with peoples who had now crossed the galaxy to stand witness for us. Vol, from the bench, invited the witnesses to address the session if they wished. Vel-Naru's voice was a low, slow weaving, translated down the tears. She said only this: "Your records call them an incompatible species. Our records call them the ship that stopped. The Othith were dying in the dark between your stars for 900 years. Your surveys flew through our drift lanes 6 times. They logged the readings and flew on. The humans were in exile, in one borrowed hull, running from your verdict, and they stopped. She let the dome hold it. The compact is not their empire. It is the stopping made law. We have come to watch them sign because we signed once, and it was true." Dak of the Colin declined the floor with a wave of one quarried hand, then took it anyway for exactly 2 sentences, which I am told are now carved above a shipyard gate on 3 worlds. "They paid our people wages when the rate was slaves everywhere else. Mind what you sign with them, counselors. They mean every word, and they will expect you to. They signed the alliance at the petitioner's rail. I asked for that, my single ceremonial indulgence in 11 weeks, and Vol granted it without a word. The instrument of equals executed on the exact spot where the accused once stood to be measured. The speaker signed for the Concord with the tally clerk's steady hand. I signed for the compact with the hand that had shaken in a coat pocket down the length of that aisle 40 years before, and it did not shake now, and behind the signatures the dome held its 2 skies, the blue one and the gray one, in perfect order. Serene Tev outlived the verdict's annulment by 104 days, and we spoke once before the end. He sent for me, and I went, because the dead of Session 4471 were owed witnesses, and so were its authors. He received me in his archive among 60 years of the Concord's memory, translucent, lucid, his clerks dismissed, and he asked me the question he had saved his remaining strength to ask. The vote, he said. My motion. The 40 years. Did it make you what you are? Some of my colleagues comfort themselves with that, you know. That the closure forged you, that we are, in some structure of history, the authors of your compact. The old reflex stirred in me, the envoy's reflex, to leave a dying adversary his comfort. I put it down. He had spent his last authority on the truth in open session. He had earned the same coin in private. No, I said. You were not our authors, Chancellor. Everything we built, we already were. The vote chose only where we would build it, in your house, or in the dark. I let him hear it land. You lost 40 years of what we are. That is all the closure ever made. The fence never forged the fire, Chancellor. It just kept you from warming yourselves. He was quiet a long time. The luminous skin had gone almost to glass, and behind it you could see the orator's mind, the Concord's memory, filing the answer where he filed everything, in the permanent record under its correct heading at last. 60 years a Chancellor, he said finally, and the truest line in my archive will be a human's. He almost smiled. The Iliath do it with their hands. Put it on the record, envoy, all of it. Promise me the historians get the version without mercy in it. Mercy is how chambers forget. It's already written, I told him, and it was most of it. These pages are the rest, and he died in the winter with his seat's hand recorded on the final tally of his life, against his own life's motion, which is the only epitaph he requested and the only one his clerks engraved. The squadron went home with the embassy, as Article 1 promised. The Rim held, as Article 2 promised. The war wound down across 2 further years into the armed, wary, livable peace that is the most any honest treaty buys. The gates in the cordon opened on schedule, outbound first by compact law, the Aveni before any great power, Mir's grandniece at the helm of the first inbound survey ship, charting the approaches her people had been laughed at for defending, and the chamber that had recorded the laughter stood when her flight plan was read into the rolls. And on the last morning of my embassy, I walked out of the Hall of the Aligned down the same aisle as before, 81 years old, escorted this time by the honor guards of 2 civilizations, through tears that rose as I passed, and I will tell you what I thought about because it is the end of the account and the truth is owed entire. I did not think about the fleet in the dome, though the feeds of 40 species have made that morning sky the emblem of the age. Fleets are arithmetic. Any frightened chamber can count hulls. Counting was never the thing my species needed that room to learn. I thought about hands, 220 of them, 40 years ago, rising in the bright air against us while a young clerk counted twice and a small gray delegate asked what we would remember. 6 of them, rising the other way, alone at a price their owners paid quietly for 4 decades. And 226 of them flat on their desks in the longest minute of my life, and then rising together, cloth and joint and air, less noise than rain, to strike the record clean. We remembered everything as it happens. The eventy delegate was right about us. We remembered the vote and the laughter and the minutes and the 6, and we spent 40 years in the dark deciding what the remembering would be for. And that decision, not the yards, not the squadrons, was the empire we built behind their fence. Any species can nurse a grievance. We chose to keep a ledger instead, and the difference between those two things is the whole distance between the war the galaxy expected and the treaty it got. A show of hands is a small thing. I have spent my life learning what it weighs. It weighs whatever the counted are worth, and we were always worth more than the count, and the proof was never the fleet in their sky. The proof was that when the room that exiled us finally called into the dark, afraid, surrounded, 40 years too late, and 1 signature from extinction, something on the far side of the wire put down 4 decades of perfect silence and answered. Let the rolls record it plainly, as the Chancellor asked, without mercy and without ornament. They raised their hands against us, and we outgrew them in the dark, and when they begged, we came, on our terms, under our flag, through gates we built in their fence. The exile is over. The cordon stands. The hands this time were counted true.